Hey everybody, it's Derek Martin from CodeOpinion.com. Is vertical slice architecture better than clean architecture or ports and adapters? When you hear people advocating for vertical slices, they're often pinning it against things like clean architecture or ports and adapters. But really, this comparison makes no sense. I'd like to thank EventStore for sponsoring this video. EventStoreDB is a new category of operational database built for event sourcing, CQRS, and event-driven microservices. For more on EventStoreDB, check out the link in the description. Most people probably recognize this diagram if they're familiar with clean architecture. I'm not going to go over everything because it's very similar in the concepts of something like ports and adapters, which I'll get to in a second. But the key thing I want to point out from this diagram, which I always want to point out, is really entities, enterprise business rules being at the very center, and these arrows, regardless of what these outside kind of rings show, what they're labeled as. Don't really care about that. What I really care about illustrating here is that the direction of these arrows are pointing inwards. This is to define the direction of dependencies. And the core being here is our business rules and these entities. And very similar, here's a diagram that most people can relate to if you're familiar with hexagonal or ports and adapters. The same type of gist that I want to get across, just like clean architecture, we have our application core at the center. This is where our business rules are going to live. Exterior to that, we're going to have different type of contracts, interfaces, which are our ports, and then we're going to have implementation of those, which are ultimately the adapters that you can see living on the outside. What's common between these two things that I'm really trying to point out here is the center, is that core. That's a domain we're building out. That's where our business rules live. That's likely to evolve and change over time because that's where the competitive advantage is of the software that we're building. You often hear, well, you don't want to mix kind of business rules and database concerns. Exactly, that's what this is trying to illustrate, is we have oftentimes a lot of I/O concerns, UI concerns, web framework concerns, messaging, other integrations to other services. We want to focus that core on being stable. Now, if I take a typical example of clean architecture, a template you might find, more on that in a second, but to illustrate it, you may have the web UI. It has a dependency on infrastructure. Infrastructure has a dependency on the application, and the application has a dependency on the domain. You may have still something like the web UI is also dependent on the application. So these are direction of dependencies. Why I mentioned stability, focus here, is because the domain is dependent on nothing, meaning that nothing can affect it. That's why it's stable, is that if something in our web UI changes, we change however that works. Maybe we have some different framework they're using. That affects the domain? None at all, nothing. Nothing has to change in our domain, in that core, because something above it is changing. That's why we want stability. In a super simplistic view of this, you're gonna have I/O. That could be on your web framework, inbound, outbound. That could be to a database, inbound, outbound. But the gist is, at the core, at the center of all this, that's where our domain lives. That's where our business rules lives. That's gonna be completely separate of any of these other concerns. And like many things in software design, we're always battling with coupling, the degree of interdependence between software modules. That's really what we're battling against, and what we're trying to achieve is that core doesn't have any dependencies, doesn't depend on anything else. Vertical slice architecture, on the other hand, doesn't come at it from the same angle, really. It's really not focusing in the same way of primarily about coupling, and that's the driver. The driver is really cohesion. So when we're looking at the typical clean architecture example, we have all these different concerns of web UI, infrastructure, application, or domain. What vertical slice is doing is really just taking off a carving off of that, of a feature set, of an individual feature. Thinking about capabilities of what actually happens in our system and really organizing our code that way. So if that means if you're thinking about vertical slices and organizing things by capabilities of what your system provides, it doesn't actually look like this, although it can. It might actually look like something like this, and that's actually the benefit of vertical slices, is that you're deciding per vertical slice, which some type of capability of your system, what kind of layers of different concerns does it actually care about? Maybe you are going to use clean architecture within some type of vertical slice or set of them. Maybe you are going to separate data access from what your business rules are. However you're going to do that. Really, the point here is that vertical slices are a way of thinking about what the functionality is, and something like ports and adapters and clean architecture are concerned about separating those concerns out and how you may achieve that. Vertical slice architecture isn't better than ports and adapters or clean architecture. They're not mutually exclusive. And I think that's what really gets confused, is thinking that it's one or the other. It's not at all. Really, again, vertical slice architecture is just thinking first and foremost about what the capabilities are of your system, organizing code that way, and then making decisions on how you deal with coupling within a vertical slice. Where things go really wrong, I think, is taking a template and using it as a prescription. So this is exactly what I was illustrating earlier. This is a template for clean architecture, where you see in .NET we have an application project, a domain project, an infrastructure project, and a web UI project. If depending on the type of system that you're building, the application that you're building, do you really need this? Maybe, maybe not. If it's a super simple to-do app, that style thing where it's just very CRUD, is this really needed? Or is this way over complex, have too much abstraction for what you actually need? Do you actually have some domain model that you actually care about that has a lot of business logic? Maybe not. And it's also worth pointing out that you do not need 4 projects. They don't have to be these exact examples. And even then, because there's these 4 projects, they're probably used in a way to enforce kind of the direction of dependencies. But you could take all these projects, smash them into one exactly how they are now, and nothing changes. How you're coupled between types is what matters, not necessarily that you have these 4 projects or 3 projects. Again, you could smush this all into one and nothing changes. And nothing changed because the coupling is exactly the same. And that's kind of the focus of this, is really how you want to deal with the coupling to your web framework, to your database, to some third-party API or library. How are you going to couple to these things? How do you want to abstract these things? Do you need to abstract these things? That's more the concern, and not necessarily, got to think about it that way, necessarily than kind of using something like clean architecture as a prescription. Ports and adapters, I think, is the best illustration of this, is there really isn't no prescription to it. It's kind of the general idea of having ports as contracts and adapters to fit those. That's really kind of the gist of the whole thing. But using something as a prescription, like something like a clean architecture template, without really kind of realizing what you're trying to do, that's kind of the recipe for kind of disaster and adding a ton of complexity when you don't really need it. So think about cohesion, think about vertical slices, think about coupling, think about ports and adapters or clean architecture or onion architecture, whatever the case may be. But really think about both. If you enjoy topics like this and you want to chat with other software developers, you kind of have questions around these topics, you can join my channel and get access to a private Discord server. Check the link in the description on how to join. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, make sure to leave a comment. And please subscribe for more videos on software architecture and design. Thanks.